The worst thing about the snow wasn't the cold, or the depth, or the way it had choked the road from Silverton back to the ranch for the third time that week. The worst thing was the silence. It was the deep, wet felted kind of quiet that swallows all sound, leaving your own heartbeat a drum in your ears, and making the crunch of your boot feel like a violation. Old man Kincaid, who'd weathered 72 winters on this patch of high-altitude Nevada sagebrush, always said a silence like that meant the mountain was holding its breath. And when a mountain held its breath, you didn't want to be around when it finally let it out. Right now, 72-year-old Kincaid's ranch, the Double K, was a dark stain on a white canvas. He and his foreman, Jesse, were sitting in the kitchen, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke, old coffee, and 2 days of unshowered tension. The single electric bulb hanging over the table cast a yellow, sickly circle on the chipped formica. "He ain't just stuck, Jesse," Kincaid rasped, turning his coffee cup slowly. His face was a map of deep-cut lines, and his eyes, usually the sharp blue of glacial ice, were clouded with worry. "Ben left on his rig 4 days ago to make the feed run down to Tonopah. Should have been back 2 nights ago." His wife called. Jesse nodded, scraping the bottom of his mug. He was a man carved from the same hard granite as the peaks outside, lean and quiet, with hands scarred from wire and frostbite. "The cell service has been dead since the blizzard blew in. Could be the mast is down. He could be waiting out the whiteout in a diner." "Not Ben. Ben knows the cut through the low pass even when he can't see his own hood ornament. Besides," Kincaid paused, looking out the window, where the glass was etched with frost and only featureless white existed beyond, "his rig had the old snow tires. The ones that need chains by law this time of year. Ben's not stupid. He wouldn't risk it unless he had to. And the dispatcher said the route was clear on Thursday." He leaned forward, lowering his voice, though there was no one else within 20 miles. "Something pushed him. Or something held him back." Jesse pushed his chair out. The sound was deafening in the silence. "I'll take the snowmobile and trace the highway cut. If he's broken down, I'll find the plume of his exhaust, or the rig's silhouette. I'll be back before last light." Kincaid looked at the younger man's grim determination. "Be careful, son. Don't take chances. You see any fresh tracks that ain't deer or coyote, you turn around." Jesse gave a short, curt nod. Out here, prudence wasn't cowardice, it was the difference between a cold night and a forever sleep. He strapped on his rifle and stepped out into the crushing weight of the snow. The landscape was a study in absolute nothingness. The world had been scrubbed clean. Frozen, jagged peaks, the spine of the Toyabe Range, were distant, hostile ghosts. The snowmobile's engine was the only sound, a buzzing insect in a cathedral built of ice. After an hour, the track, already faint, ended where the high plain met a long, gently sloping ridge. Jesse cut the engine. The silence returned, heavy and immediate, like a blanket thrown over his head. He scanned the expanse with binoculars. Nothing but endless, rolling drifts. But as he dropped the glasses, something caught his eye, something dark that did not belong, the mouth of an abandoned silver mine, the shaft boarded up a decade ago, barely visible on the ridge's flank. He took a bearing and started walking, post-holing through drifts that fought him with every step. He reached the mine shaft. The door, sealed with a rotten plank nailed diagonally, was split. Not kicked in, or crowbarred. Split. As if something massive had simply leaned against it until the wood cracked down the grain. Jesse knelt in the snow. Near the broken door, partially filled, were tire tracks. Not Ben's heavy-duty truck tires, but the narrow, lug tracks of the snowmobile Ben had kept chained up in the back of his rig, the small emergency sled, the one he only ever used if the truck broke down miles from help. Ben had abandoned his truck, taken the small snowmobile, and driven it into an abandoned mine. Jesse's blood went cold, not from the air, but from the impossible implication. Why would anyone, let alone the cautious, practical Ben, enter a crumbling, abandoned mine in a blizzard with a working snowmobile? He followed the tracks into the gloom. The interior was a cavern of rough-hewn timbers and perpetual winter. The air inside was still, frozen, and held the metallic, dusty smell of dry earth and old ore. The tracks, illuminated by his headlamp, were clear on the frozen dirt floor. They led 50 yards in, then stopped abruptly. Jesse reached the spot. The snowmobile sat there, still and silent, half covered in dust, looking perfectly functional. The key was in the ignition. And Ben was gone. There were no footprints leading away from the machine. The mine tunnel was straight. Ben had ridden the snowmobile to this point, stopped, dismounted, and then vanished. Jesse checked the dirt again, his heart hammering in the hollow quiet. No sign of a scuffle, no dragging marks. He followed the beam of his lamp around the tunnel walls. Nothing. Finally, he knelt by the snowmobile itself. He ran his gloved hand over the cold seat, then stopped. Tucked into the gap between the seat cushion and the body was a piece of folded paper. He pulled it out, a ripped corner of a delivery manifest, still smelling faintly of gasoline. He unfolded it carefully. Ben hadn't written a note. He'd drawn something. It was a crude, hasty pencil sketch. In the center was a stick figure, clearly meant to be a man, his arms flung wide in alarm. But what was drawn around the figure made Jesse's stomach knot into a cold, hard stone. The man was surrounded by a multitude of other figures, tall and thin, but they were all rendered wrong. Not like people. They had no faces. And where their legs should have been, the lines simply tapered into the ground, blurring with the dirt, like they were being absorbed by it, or growing from it. Above them, in shaky letters, Ben had scrawled a single word. W-A-I-T-I-N-G. Jesse stood up, slowly, the cold silence of the mine pressing in on him. He felt an intense, irrational certainty that the moment he turned his back on the machine, he wouldn't be alone. He backed up until he hit the tunnel wall, training his lamp everywhere at once. The silent, empty, timbered tunnel. The still, waiting air. He took a single, deliberate breath that fogged thick in the cold. Ben, Jesse called out, his voice thin and hollow. The echo came back, flat and dead, Ben. And then, a heartbeat later, something else came back. Not a sound, not an echo, but a feeling. The sense that the cold, packed dirt under his boots was not merely inert earth. That the weight of the mountain above was not just rock and snow, but a colossal, patient presence. And that the silence, the absolute, crushing silence, was a tool. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the careful, delicate removal of it, the way a predator will clear a space before a meal. Jesse didn't wait to see if the snowmobile tracks led out of the mine again. He turned and ran. He ran back into the white world, into the open air and the brutal cold, clutching the crude drawing, knowing he would rather face the raging blizzard than the stillness waiting in the dark. He rode the snowmobile back, not daring to look behind him. When he made it to the ranch just before nightfall, Kincaid saw the haunted, raw fear in his eyes and didn't ask a single question. They sat in the quiet kitchen, the fire banked, the wind a low moan outside. Kincaid, without a word, reached for the old ranch ledger and carefully tore out a blank sheet. He pushed it across the table to Jesse, along with a pencil. "Draw me the mine," the old man said, his voice flat. Jesse picked up the pencil, his hand shaking, and sketched the ridge, the snowmobile, and the tunnel entrance. He avoided putting in the figures. Kincaid leaned over the drawing, his deep-set eyes tracing the lines. Then, he pointed to the empty space where the tunnel met the ridge. "Was the plank door open, Jesse?" "Split." "Half hanging," Jesse whispered. Kincaid sighed, a dry, weary sound. "That's right. Because the mountain doesn't like doors. It likes the edges blurred." Ben was taken by the white silence. "It doesn't want you to know it's coming. It just wants you to step over the line." He picked up a piece of kindling from the wood bin, its bark rough and dry. He ran his thumb over the grain, his gaze distant, fixed on the frozen darkness outside the window. 2 years back, little Janie Potter, over by Big Creek. Vanished off the porch swing. Search party found her little boots 20 feet from the house. Perfectly placed, side by side. Nobody thought to look in the abandoned well on the edge of their field. It was always boarded over. Until that day. The board was split, like yours. Kincaid looked at Jesse, his eyes finally clear and sharp. The mountains got hungry places. Places where the line between here and somewhere else gets thin. The cold helps it. The silence is how it calls. It doesn't take the weak, Jesse. It takes the ones trying hardest to run. It takes the ones who stop to look at what they shouldn't have seen. He tossed the kindling into the stove. Now, the worst part, Kincaid continued, his voice dropping to a near inaudible rumble. The snowmobile. Why did he ride it right in and stop? Ben wouldn't waste gas. Jesse stared at the stove fire, hypnotized by the flicker. He drew those things, the figures. No, Kincaid shook his head slowly. He didn't draw them. He was showing you why he stopped. Ben had to show you where the silence starts. You heard it when you called his name. It was right there. The next morning, the snow was falling again, gentle and relentless. Kincaid was gone. His bed was neatly made, a note taped to the pillow. Jesse picked it up. It was a single, clean square of paper. The note simply read. My turn to make the feed run. See you next thaw. Jesse walked out into the falling snow, his breath white and fragile. The gate to the main corral was open. He walked to the snowmobile shed. Old man Kincaid's snowmobile was gone. And as the flakes landed, whispering secrets on his shoulders, Jesse noticed a single, thin set of footprints leading away from the shed and toward the high plain. They were not Kincaid's heavy, insulated boot prints. They were bare. And they were slowly being covered by the gathering, absolute silence. He stood there, holding the thin piece of paper, listening to the world disappear. He finally understood why the mountain held its breath. It was waiting for him to stop running. Second story. The first clue was the smell of wood smoke in a place that had no chimneys left to draw it. Deputy Silas Boone had been trailing the busted transmission line for 5 hours on a snowcat, his face stiff with cold and bad temper. It was 20 below on the Wyoming high desert, a wind-scoured wilderness of frozen sagebrush and sheer, hostile distance. The line had snapped somewhere between the ghost town of Red Cloud and the Black Fork substation, meaning a dozen ranches were running on generators, and Silas was the only soul the county could spare to find the break before dark. He was 20 miles past anything with a proper name when he saw it, a pale plume of smoke, thin and vertical, rising from the snow-covered hollow that used to be the old Bellamy homestead. The Bellamys had been gone 30 years, victims of a land grant scam, a hard winter, and a final, bitter family feud that ended with a shack burned down to the foundation. No one ever rebuilt. The land was poisonous with bad memory. Silas cut the engine. The silence that followed was instant and absolute, a weight pressing on his eardrums. He pulled his shotgun from the rack, chambering a shell with a metallic clackshake. Out here, you didn't assume goodwill. He hiked down the slope, the snow squeaking like dry chalk under his insulated boots. The homestead ruins were mostly stones and frozen, blackened timbers sunk into the drifts, but tucked against the windbreak of ancient cottonwoods, someone had built a fire. And sitting beside it was a man. He was old, wrapped in oilskin and threadbare wool, face lined like sun-baked clay. He wasn't looking at Silas. He was looking at something he held in his lap, a small, crudely carved wooden bird. Afternoon, Silas called out, his voice heavy and loud in the quiet. You lost, friend. This is private land. The man didn't flinch. He just kept turning the wooden bird over and over in his hands. Silas stepped closer, squinting. The name's Silas Boone, deputy for Sweetwater County. You mind telling me what you're doing on the Bellamy property? The old man finally looked up. His eyes were wide, watery, and a pale, unsettling blue, the color of old ice, or maybe skim milk. You look for the break? The old man asked, his voice a dry whisper that seemed to come from his throat without disturbing the air. The big one? You won't find it. The transmission line is down, Silas corrected, impatient. I'm looking for the break. The line isn't broken, the old man said, and a slow, terrible smile stretched across his mouth, like splitting leather. The score is broken. The freeze-up score. Silas felt a prickle of unease that had nothing to do with the temperature. Look, I don't know what you're talking about. I need you to pack up your fire, tell me where your vehicle is, and move on. The old man finally set the wooden bird down on the snow. He lifted one hand, pointing toward the skeletal remains of the burned-out shack. In '94, when the Bellamy boy took the shotgun to his father over the water rights, they didn't know about the score, he said, his voice gaining a strange, rhythmic quality. They only felt the cold. The land, it holds a tune. A hum. Keeps the frost from biting deeper than it ought. Silas took a step back. This wasn't some poor old squatter, this was a crazy person, and armed crazy people in the middle of nowhere were the worst kind. I'm done talking, Silas said, raising the shotgun slightly. Show me your hands, slow. The old man ignored the gun. He was gazing at the fire, which burned unnaturally clear and bright despite the fresh snow trying to smother it. There's too much anger in the cold now, Deputy, he murmured. Too many lies buried in the drifts. The tune can't hold it all. So the score breaks. And when the score breaks, the land, it starts to listen. Silas felt a chill that passed clean through his heavy parka. The old man wasn't shivering. He didn't look cold at all. Then Silas saw the man's boots. They weren't leather or rubber. They were stiff, woven mats of what looked like dried, yellowish reed, laced tightly around his ankles. And where they met the snow, there was no sign of melting, no indentation. It was as if he barely weighed anything. Silas took another step back, fighting the urge to turn and run. I'm calling this in. You'll be talking to the sheriff. He reached for the heavy satellite phone clipped to his belt. The old man began to hum. It was a single, low note, barely audible, yet it vibrated in the stillness, settling deep in Silas's chest. The tune was toneless, hypnotic, and utterly wrong. As the old man hummed, Silas looked down at the snowcat. The windshield was coated with a thin, perfect layer of ice, so clear it looked like polished glass. And beneath the ice, pressed flat against the glass itself, was something that hadn't been there 2 minutes ago. It was a delicate, flattened pattern. Like a fern. Or a frozen feather. Silas frowned and walked over to the snowcat, running a gloved finger over the glass. The ice wouldn't crack. He leaned closer. It wasn't just a pattern. It was a print. The clear, perfect impression of an ear, tiny ribs visible beneath the thin skin. A human ear. Silas straightened up, his heart hammering. He looked back at the old man, who was now smiling wider, still humming the broken tune. You smell the cold, Deputy? The old man asked. It's hungry. The land, it wants its score kept clean. And the only way to clean a score is to take the sound. The man rose, fluidly, without effort. He walked toward Silas, not looking at him, but at the power line pole just beyond. As he stepped over a pile of frozen stone, Silas heard a noise that was instantly masked by the wind, a faint, dry, papery rattle. Silas didn't think. He turned and sprinted back up the ridge toward his snowcat. He reached the door, fumbling with the latch. He heard the old man's humming note change pitch, rising, becoming a pure, thin whine that hurt his teeth. Silas scrambled inside the cab, slammed the door, and locked it. He cranked the ignition. Nothing. Just a sick, grinding clack. The engine was frozen solid. He threw his parka hood off and pressed his hands against the frozen window, trying to wipe away the glaze of ice. The old man was standing right outside the cab, his face inches from the glass. His eyes were no longer watery blue. They were the color of lead, and they were fixed on Silas's mouth. Then Silas looked down at the dash. His satellite phone was gone. And where it had been clipped, there was another perfect, flattened ear print, pressed smooth against the plastic. The old man spoke, and the sound was so close, so clear, it seemed to be coming from inside the cab with him. "You got a good voice, Deputy. Loud. The land hears it. We need to set the score right. Needs the high notes." Silas watched, paralyzed, as the old man lifted his hands. His fingers were long and straight, and the fingernails were not white, but clear, like thin chips of polished glacier ice. The old man reached up and gently, delicately, touched the center of the ice-glazed windshield. Silas saw the pressure point, the faintest ripple in the glass. And then, slowly, agonizingly, a soundless crack branched out from the old man's fingertip, tracing a line through the ice. It was a crack that didn't shatter the glass. It merely separated it. As the line of the crack completed its circuit, a single, circular piece of the windshield, about the size of a teacup, simply detached from the frame and fell inward. It fell onto Silas's lap, perfectly round and smooth. The wind did not rush in. The cold did not rush in. Only the silence came, sharp and overwhelming, carrying with it the humming note. Silas looked down at the circle of glass in his lap. On the outside, pressed clean against the surface, was the perfectly preserved, flattened ear. On the inside, where his breath should have condensed, there was nothing but clear, polished glass. Silas opened his mouth to scream, but the cold, deep silence rushed in, filling his throat, choking his voice. The old man smiled, his leaden eyes fixed on Silas's open mouth, and then he reached a long, thin, glass-tipped finger through the hole in the window. The finger did not go for Silas's eyes, or his chest. It went for his lips, tracing the line of his silence. Silas Boone was found 3 days later, frozen to death inside the snowcat. The autopsy showed his lungs were clear, his body untouched. The only anomaly was his mouth, wide open, frozen in a silent, agonizing shout. And on the dashboard, the sheriff found the deputy's shotgun, resting right beside a small, perfectly carved wooden bird. Its beak was frozen open. Third story. The old hands in the mining towns of the high Rockies, the ones who'd seen too much silver turn to dust, didn't fear the blizzards or the wolf packs. They feared the false horizon. It only appeared in deep winter, when the snow fell straight down for days, turning the world into a seamless white bowl where sky met land without definition. It was the whiteout so total it convinced you the ground was climbing and the air was solid. It was the feeling that the earth itself had been erased, leaving only the cold and the knowledge of your own small death. That was the horizon that Sheriff Holt was facing, squinting through the smeared, half-frozen windshield of his '78 Ford pickup. He was driving the old logging road outside the dying town of Cripple Creek, Colorado. It was late afternoon, and the light was already failing, flat and gray. Holt was on a retrieval. An hour ago, a drifter named Micah had stumbled into the general store, frostbitten and barely coherent, claiming he'd found something in the ruins of the Red Arrow claim, a gold rush mine abandoned since 1893. He hadn't found gold. He'd found a body. Holt had driven the stretch of road 1,000 times, but today, every curve felt alien, every familiar pine tree swallowed by the fog of snow. He passed the marker for the claim, a rusted, leaning wheelbarrow stuck in a snowdrift, and drove another half-mile. Then he stopped. There was a truck. Not Micah's old junker, but a big, clean, late-model Dodge Power wagon, pristine white, sitting at a sharp, impossible angle, as if the driver had turned the wheel hard and just quit. No tracks led to it but his own. The truck hadn't been driven into the snow. It had been driven onto it. Holt cut his engine and grabbed his heavy wool coat, his .30-30 Winchester, and his inspection lantern. He walked over to the Dodge. The cab was locked, but the windows were clear. There was a man inside, young, wearing expensive gear. He wasn't bloody or frozen in panic. He was simply sitting upright, hands resting loosely on the wheel, eyes open, staring straight ahead at the dashboard. Holt smashed the driver's side window with the butt of his rifle. The sound was muffled by the snow, a dull thud tinkle. He pulled the man out. The body was still pliable, not fully frozen, but unnaturally cold. As Holt dragged him, his attention was drawn back to the Dodge's dashboard. The ignition was off. The interior light was on. And the fuel gauge was pinned. Not on E, but pegged against the far right side of the housing, vibrating slightly, indicating the tank was beyond full. Holt frowned. Broken gauges usually default to 0 or float erratically. Pin to full. That was mechanical impossibility. He let the body slide onto the snow, then swung the lantern beam inside the cab, scanning the floor, the seats. The radio was on, tuned to static, but something was odd about the heater controls. They were set to maximum heat, maximum fan speed. But the air rushing out of the vents wasn't warm, it was frigid, cutting cold, smelling faintly of old dust and dry, winterized pine. Then he saw the keys. They weren't in the ignition. They were lying on the passenger seat, right next to a laminated wallet card. Holt picked up the card. It was a state parks search and rescue ID. The dead man was named Cole, a volunteer climber, maybe out looking for Micah's initial signal. Holt looked back at the pinned fuel gauge, then out at the false horizon, the white, shifting veil where the air seemed to be turning to snow and the snow seemed to be turning to mountain. He knew what he was looking at. The truck hadn't broken down. Cole had stopped, and then something inside the closed cab, in the controlled air, had convinced him to do three things. Turn off the engine. Take the key out of the ignition. Set the heat to maximum. Holt looked down at the dead man on the snow. No sign of struggle, no wounds. He had simply shut down, eyes open, staring at the lie of the fuel gauge. He froze himself, Holt muttered to the wind, the absurdity of it chilling him deeper than the temperature. He loaded the body into the back of his pickup, covered it with a tarp, and went back to the Dodge. He needed to check the engine. He opened the hood. Everything was clean, new, perfect. But resting on the engine block, nestled between the alternator and the battery housing, was a single, long, pale feather, the kind you might find from a high-altitude hawk or an owl. It was placed so carefully, it couldn't have fallen there. Holt picked it up. It wasn't just a feather. It felt brittle and hollow, like dry paper. He looked back at the dashboard. The fuel gauge was still pegged beyond full. The gauge of the dead, an old prospector had once whispered to him in a bar, years ago, fueled by bad whiskey and worse memory. When the land wants you, it don't just kill you. It makes you welcome the end. It'll lie to you. Tell you you're full, tell you you're warm, tell you you've got all the road you need right here. Holt slammed the hood down. He got back in his own truck and drove the remaining distance to the Red Arrow claim. The old mine entrance was a gaping, square mouth in the hillside, braced by rotted timbers. The air rushing out of it smelled of damp rock and decay. He found the lantern Micah had dropped. He followed the light beam into the slope. The tunnel was dark, narrow, and immediately frigid. The air was still. 50 feet in, he found him. Micah, the drifter. He was sitting on the ground, back against the timbered wall, clutching his knees. He was alive, shivering violently, but his eyes, like the dead man's, were wide and fixed. But Micah wasn't staring at a gauge. He was staring at the wall right in front of him. "Sheriff," Micah rasped, his voice a dry wheeze. "The body. I didn't touch it. It's right there." Holt swung his lantern. There was a depression in the dirt, the imprint of a long-gone body. But no body. It's gone, Micah. What did you see? Micah didn't look at him. He was sitting there. Like a scarecrow. All leathered up, like a miner from the old times. And he had a tin box. A lunch pail. He was holding it. Where is the pail now? He told me, Micah whispered, tears starting to freeze on his cheeks. He told me he had enough. Enough what? Enough warmth, Micah said, choking on the word. He said he had saved up enough heat in the box to get him through the freeze-up. He said there was too much winter outside, but if I just came in and sat with him, we'd have plenty. Holt gripped his rifle tighter. And where is the box? Micah's eyes finally slid toward Holt. They were the eyes of a man who had chosen to freeze in the dark rather than trust the light. He told me to take the gauge, Micah said, his voice flat and dead. He said, you just trust the reading, son. You never run from a full gauge. And then he walked out. Holt knelt down, noticing something in the soft earth. Just beside where Micah's hand was gripping the dirt, there was a small, circular impression, the exact size and shape of a vintage fuel gauge housing. Holt looked back at the tunnel entrance. The square of gray light was fading fast. He took Micah by the collar and dragged him out, ignoring the man's weak protests. He pulled him up the slope and threw him into the cab of the pickup, then went to retrieve his rifle. As he closed his door, he glanced one last time at the dashboard. His own fuel gauge was now glowing. It had been sitting at 3/4 tank when he started the day. Now, the needle was trembling, slowly, inexorably, pinning itself against the far right side, pointing straight at the F4 full. The cab was warm from the residual heat of his engine, but Holt felt the temperature dropping faster than it should have. He reached up to adjust the heat. His hand stopped. He didn't turn the knob. He looked out the windshield at the false horizon, where the snow fog was so thick it looked like pale stone. He didn't see the road. He saw only distance, cold, and quiet. He knew, with a bone-deep, frontier certainty, that the gauge was a lie, and the warmth in his cab was a borrowed mercy. And if he trusted the gauge, if he turned off the engine, took the keys, and settled in to enjoy his full tank of warmth, he would be found staring ahead, not at the road, but at the comfortable, murderous lie on his dashboard. Holt put the truck in gear and drove, not back toward town, but forward, into the deepening white. He knew the gauge was full of dead man's heat. He drove at 50 miles an hour, watching the needle stay pegged, driving faster than he needed, trying to drain the tank, trying to outrun the certainty that somewhere ahead, in the obliterating white, the real road was waiting to disappear. He drove until the darkness was absolute, the fuel gauge still mocking him with its fullness, and the air in the cab smelling powerfully of dry pine and dust. He never stopped. Fourth story. The wind didn't howl in the high New Mexico plains, it sounded like dry sand being poured over sheet iron. It was the kind of wind that scoured the paint off houses and the history out of men's bones. Elias, 52, and built like a fence post, hated the wind more than the frost. The frost killed you quick. The wind took its time, wearing you down until the grit in your teeth felt less bothersome than the grit in your soul. Elias had been caretaker of the Widow's Peak mine site for 7 years, a 30-mile run south of the nearest civilization, which was less a town and more a single, sad gas station. His only company was a rusty generator, a 12-gauge pump, and the weight of his own decisions. He was sitting at his worn pine table, cleaning the pump gun, when the generator sputtered, coughed, and died. The abrupt silence was immediate and profound, a physical blow that left his ears ringing. He lit a kerosene lamp. In the flickering yellow light, the shack looked like a cabin in a daguerreotype, sharp, stark, and brittle. Elias knew the drill. Old generator, deep freeze. Bad mixture. He pulled on his sheepskin coat and grabbed his flashlight. He stepped outside. The cold hit him like a concrete slab. The wind had dropped, leaving the air heavy and crystalline. The moon, 3/4 full, was a cruel silver coin above the frozen, jagged peaks of the Sangre de Cristos. He walked the 50 yards to the generator shed. The snow was thin here, scraped clean by the wind, revealing patches of frozen earth and stone. He opened the shed door. The generator was cold, fuel lines probably iced up. He swore under his breath, leaning down to check the oil. As he was bent over, the beam of his flashlight skimmed the ground just outside the shed door. He froze. In the thin, scraped snow, there was a set of fresh tracks. They were unmistakably human, heavy boot prints, distinct and deep, leading directly to the generator shed. Elias straightened up, his heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He had not heard a car, a truck, or a snowmobile. Nothing crossed this valley unless it was planned, and no one visited Elias. Not since the business with the claim jumper last spring. He followed the tracks back toward the shack. They were leading not away from the road, but from the mine shaft, half a mile away. And the tracks were all wrong. They led to the shack, then straight back to the generator shed, then stopped abruptly at the shed door. There were no tracks leading away from the shed. Elias knelt down, shining the light directly on the final print. It was a heavy, square-toed boot, covered in a fine gray dust that looked like tailings from the mine. He looked closer. The print was not fully sunk. It was deep in the heel, then almost perfectly flat through the sole, and then barely touching the snow at the toe. Like a man carrying something impossibly heavy, dragging his weight. Elias stood up. He walked back to the shack, retrieved the 12-gauge, and went out again. He was past fear, this was the cold, hard logic of survival. He followed the tracks leading back toward the mine shaft. The closer he got to the massive, shuttered opening, the stronger the smell became, not just cold metal and dust, but something else. Something sharp, metallic, and old, like frozen blood and rusted iron. He reached the shaft. The heavy steel door, which he'd double-locked and secured with a logging chain 3 months ago, was standing ajar. Not forced. Unlatched. Elias knew better than to go in. Old mine shafts in the winter are traps, the air gets stagnant, the timbers warp. But the tracks, the heavy, uneven drag marks, led straight into the absolute darkness. Who's in there? Elias barked, the sound swallowed instantly by the hollow space. Only the cold, metallic smell answered. Elias stepped inside, his boots crunching on the loose gravel. He held the shotgun ready, the flashlight beam cutting a wobbly, nervous circle in the blackness. The tunnel was wide, supported by century-old, sweating timbers. 50 feet in, the ceiling dipped, and the air shifted, turning suddenly dead and still. He found the tracks again, but here, on the damp, earthen floor, they were accompanied by something else, a drag mark. A long, deep groove running between the tracks, as if the heavy weight that had created the prints had scraped along the ground. The drag mark stopped at a timber-braced alcove, a side pocket carved out by the original miners. Elias shone his light into the small space. It was empty, save for a pile of loose, wet tailings and a single object resting on the ground. It was a pair of old, heavy leather boots, worn smooth, and covered in gray mine dust. The laces were neatly tied. They were the exact size and shape of the prints he had followed. Elias lowered the shotgun, utterly bewildered. He reached out and touched one of the boots. It was stiff, frozen solid. Then he noticed the inside. Both boots were filled to the brim, packed hard with something dense and heavy. He ran his fingers inside the cuff. It was earth. But not soft earth. It was a mixture of frozen mud, iron ore, and what looked like pulverized bone. The boots were weighted. And then Elias saw the inscription, crudely carved into the side of the timber directly above the boots. It wasn't a name or a date. It was a single, careful phrase. The balance had to be made right. Elias felt a cold dread settle in his gut. He knew that phrase. It was what the old miners said when frontier justice had been dealt, when a life had been taken to square a debt. He backed away, out of the alcove, turning to flee. But as he reached the mouth of the tunnel, he stopped. The air in the tunnel had changed again. It wasn't still anymore. It was moving, but not like wind. It was moving down. Down the shaft, toward him, gathering speed. A cold, heavy current of air smelling of the metallic rot he'd first noticed. Elias didn't wait. He sprinted out of the tunnel and back toward the relative safety of his shack. He was 100 yards away when he heard a sound from the generator shed. Not the familiar clatter of the engine, but a faint, rhythmic thud shuffle. He skidded to a stop, hiding behind a pile of old rail ties, lowering himself into the snow. He watched the shed door. It opened. And the tracks led out. The heavy, square-toed prints, uneven and dragging, led away from the shed and toward the mine shaft. But now, they were not just prints. Elias could see the shadow of the walker. It was indistinct, hunched, and tall. Elias raised the shotgun, sighting down the barrel at the moving shadow. Then he saw the figure clearly in the bright moonlight. It was human-shaped, covered entirely in a fine layer of gray, frozen mine dust. It was walking with that heavy, asymmetrical gait, deep heel print, flat sole, light toe. It wasn't wearing boots. The walker was barefooted, and its feet, like the empty boots he'd found, were packed solid with frozen earth and ore, making each step a laborious, dragging effort. It was the weight that was moving the feet, not the man. And in its outstretched hands, held carefully, was the gasoline can from the generator shed. It was walking the fuel back to the mine. As the figure passed the shack, it paused. It tilted its head, and the fine gray dust shifted, revealing nothing but a smooth, pale layer beneath. It wasn't looking at the shack. It was looking at the small plume of smoke rising from Elias's chimney, the evidence of his warmth, his life, his continued imbalance. Elias didn't shoot. He couldn't. This wasn't a claim jumper. This was the long, slow, cold weight of a reckoning that had come for a missing piece. The figure shuffled on, disappearing into the dark maw of the mine shaft. Elias sat in the snow until his coat was stiff and his fingers were numb. He eventually stood up and walked back to his shack. He opened the door, stepped inside, and dropped his shotgun. The kerosene lamp was still burning on the pine table. Beside it, the oilskin coat he'd draped over a chair was gone. And hanging in its place, clean and dry, was a different coat. A century-old, patched coat of stiff, heavy leather, smelling strongly of frozen earth and sulfur. It was the kind of coat a man would wear working a mine 100 years ago. On the table, sitting right where the shotgun had been, was a square tin lunch pail. Elias slowly opened the pail. It was full of ash. Cold, fine, white ash. The perfect, weightless kind that remains when everything important has been burned away. Elias walked to his window. The gray, uneven tracks had returned. They led from the mine, past the shed, right up to the cabin door. And then they stopped. The heavy, weighted earth, Elias knew, was waiting for the balance to be paid in full. The balance wasn't blood, it was weight. It was the weight of a life, trading the solid ground he'd taken for the weightless lie of the cold. He looked at the leather coat, the ash, and the growing, heavy cold radiating from the tin lunch pail. He knew he had two choices: put on the heavy leather coat and walk the weight back into the dark where it belonged, or wait for the ash to turn into earth, and the dry, cold balance to be completed for him. He picked up the coat. It was heavier than it looked. Fifth story. The thing that brought men to the Montana copper fields wasn't the promise of wealth, it was the promise of forgetting. You could bury a debt, a name, or a bad choice deeper than any mine shaft out here, provided the mountains didn't decide to dig it back up. Silas Finch, a man who had successfully forgotten most of his past, was halfway to forgetting the present, too. He sat in his tiny, rented shack in the near-dead town of Bitter Creek, the air thick with pipe smoke and the dry, metallic cold that bit through the walls. He was the last man left keeping the lights on for the defunct Black Butte Mining Company. He was paid to wait for a buyer who would never come. The only thing that kept Silas anchored to reality was the noise, the slow, rhythmic thump-thump of the old water pump, a mile and a half up the high ridge. It ran 24 hours a day, keeping the main shaft from flooding. If the pump stopped, the mine was forfeit and Silas was jobless. At 2:17 a.m., the thump-thump stopped. Silas dropped his book. The ensuing silence wasn't just a lack of noise, it was a physical pressure, like the air itself had solidified. The vast, snow-covered landscape outside, frozen prairie below, towering, black mountains above, seemed to lean in. He bundled up, grabbed his wrench and his lantern, and stepped outside. The cold was a living thing, hostile and immediate. Above him, the moon was dark, just a missing piece of the sky, leaving the world steeped in a heavy, starless black. He started the old pickup. The engine caught on the third try, groaning in protest. The drive up the ridge was treacherous. The trail was ice-slicked and drifted over. After 15 minutes, the truck died. Not from a lack of gas or a broken line. It just quit. Everything, engine, lights, radio, went dead, all at once. Silas took his tools and started walking. The pump house was another half-mile, a small cinder block hut perched on the highest point of the company land. He reached the pump house. The door, usually chained but never locked, who would steal a century-old pump, was standing ajar. He pushed it open. The air inside was warm, humid, and smelled strongly of ozone and burnt oil. The massive pump, a relic of the 40s, was silent. The control panel showed a green light for power and a red light for overload. Silas walked around the machine. He didn't see the usual blown fuse or snapped belt. The pump looked fine. But on the large, iron-cased motor, something was written. Scratched deep into the grime of the casing with a sharp tool, forming clean, stark letters. PAID. Silas frowned, running a gloved finger over the scratch marks. He checked the floor. No footprints other than his own. He walked to the pump's heavy inflow pipe, the one that pulled water from the main sump. He shone his light down into the concrete trench. The water was there, still and dark, inches below the grate. And floating on the surface of the water was a book. Silas wrestled the grate off and used the hook end of his wrench to fish the book out. It was a small, leather-bound ledger, soaked through but mostly intact. The leather was stiff, the pages warped. It was the kind of notebook the original foreman kept, a tally book. He carefully opened it. The ink was faded, listing names, dates, and hours worked from 1917. But the final page, the one that should have contained the current inventory, was blank except for one entry. The book was not just wet, it was saturated with the foul, oily water from the mine sump. And yet, the pencil writing was perfectly dry. Silas looked back at the motor. Paid. The pump had stopped. The mine was flooding. And somehow, his name was on a ledger for a water debt. He turned and bolted from the shed, scrambling back down the slick path, ignoring the dead truck, running on pure, adrenalized panic. He reached his shack and locked the door, throwing the dead bolt home with a furious clack. He leaned against the door, gasping, the cold air burning his lungs. The mine was flooding. He had to call someone. He fumbled for the desk phone, the old, cranky landline that was the town's last link to the outside world. He picked up the receiver. It was silent. The line was dead. Then he looked at the handset. It was resting neatly on the hook, but there was a knot tied in the coiled cord, a small, clean, tight knot that hadn't been there when he left. Silas stared at the knot, his mind racing. Someone had been here. They had let the pump stop, they had written his name in the ledger, and they had knotted his phone line. He backed away from the desk, grabbing his shotgun. He walked to the window and wiped a circle in the frost. Outside, the absolute darkness seemed to have deepened. The mountains were gone, swallowed by the black sky. And then he saw them. In the faint, diffuse light spilling from his kerosene lamp, a trail of footprints leading from his back door, away from the shack, and toward the main road. They were shallow, shuffling prints, but they were perfectly clean and dry, as if the walker had not touched the snow. Silas cracked the back door open, sniffing the air. The smell of ozone and burnt oil, the smell from the pump house, was now strong, clinging to the air around his shack. He stepped outside, following the prints. They led only 20 feet, straight to the edge of the shallow, snow-covered gulch behind his property. The prints stopped abruptly at the lip of the gulch. And down in the darkness of the ravine, illuminated only by the light of his own lamp, Silas saw something that made him retch. It wasn't a body. It was a collection of things. A rusted pickaxe head, a bundle of wet, brittle canvas, and a dozen or so small, dark, oblong shapes. He scrambled down the bank, sliding on the frozen earth. He picked up one of the shapes. It was a potato, rock-hard and blackened by years in the cold ground. It was food, preserved and old. He picked up the canvas. It was a section of a jacket, and as he unfolded it, he saw the faint, brittle stitching of a name tag, sewn inside, T. Miller. Miller. The name came back to him in a rush of cold panic. Tom Miller. His first partner. The man he'd robbed of his share of the first big vein, 3 decades ago, leaving him stranded in a busted-up shack during the first hard freeze. The man who never made it out of Bitter Creek. Silas dropped the jacket. He finally looked up at the wall of the ravine. And he saw where the small pile of objects had come from. Scratched into the frozen mud and rock of the ravine wall, about waist-high, was a dark opening, barely a foot wide. It was a tiny, secondary shaft, hidden and long forgotten, leading down. From the hole, a faint, cold mist was seeping out. And mixed with the mist was the distinct smell of ozone and burnt oil. Silas pointed his lamp back at the small pile of artifacts. The cold, black food, the scrap of clothing. The things a man would have needed to survive, now delivered to the surface. He looked back at the empty, clean, dry tracks leading to the gulch. The man who walked those prints was gone, having paid his debt in full, not in copper, but in the absence of warmth, delivered to the surface, and exchanged for Silas's name in the cold ledger. Silas scrambled back out of the gulch, heart exploding in his chest. He reached his shack and slammed the door shut. He didn't turn on the lights. He sat in the darkness, clutching the shotgun, listening to the heavy, crushing silence. The pump was dead. The mine was flooding. And then, faintly, rising above the silence, he heard a new sound. It was a slow, steady, rhythmic thump-thump. It wasn't coming from the ridge. It was coming from below his floorboards. Heavy, dull, and wet. The sound of something enormous working deep in the earth, taking water out of the mine and bringing it somewhere else. Silas looked down at the floor, which was suddenly slick with a film of cold, mine-scented water that hadn't been there a moment before. The pump was running. It was working the water debt. He lifted his foot and peeled back the rug. The floorboards were swelling, warped by the sudden moisture. And scratched into the wood, forming a wide, wet circle right beneath his chair, was one final, chilling word. Talllied. He sat there, the water seeping around his boots, listening to the pump running deep beneath him, knowing he was the only man left in the world keeping the lights on for the Black Butte mine. And his debt, once forgotten, was just beginning to accrue. 6th story. The temperature gauge inside the rusted-out Dodge truck had been stuck at -31 degrees Fahrenheit for a week, and it lied. Sheriff Thorne knew the air outside the thin metal skin of the vehicle was colder than that, a killing, crystalline cold that felt less like temperature and more like pressure, an invisible hammer coming down on the bones. He was driving the last 30 miles of a county road that hadn't seen a plow since the first week of December. Now, it was mid-February. The road was a ghost of cracked asphalt underneath 6 feet of consolidated drift snow, visible only because the old fence posts lining it were still standing, black teeth gnawing at the sky. Thorne hated the Salt Creek Basin in the winter. It was flat, open country between the Grizzlies and the Crow Peaks, a place where the wind started in Siberia and didn't slow down until it hit the Dakotas. It was also the territory of the O'Malley Ranch, and the O'Malleys hadn't answered their landline for 4 days. He stopped the truck where the lane branched off toward their property. It was nothing but a tire track now, a shallow furrow in the snow where someone had recently driven an ATV. Thorne killed the engine. The sudden silence was a physical blow, a vacuum rushing in to replace the constant rumble of the cold-soaked motor. In the deep quiet, he heard the faint, high-pitched scree of the metal cooling. He pulled the heavy .30-06 from its rack, checked the chamber, and zipped up his waxed canvas parka. As he stepped out, the snow gave a dry, squeaky groan beneath his insulated boot, the sound of an unburied corpse turning over. But it was the sky that made him pause. The air was utterly still, no wind, which was unnatural for the basin. And the sky, low and heavy, was the color of old, curdled milk. Normally, in this kind of cold, the crows roost in the skeletal cottonwoods along the creek, thousands of them, a black, noisy river. They were a fixture of the cold, a sign that there was still life, or at least carrion, in the world. Today, the trees were empty. Not a single bird. Not a track, not a drop of scat. Just bare, gray wood and the blank, white field. Thorne hitched his rifle and started walking. The ranch house was a mile in, a squat, 3-room structure built of heavy river rock 80 years ago, leaning slightly under the weight of time and snow. Smoke should have been feathering out of the chimney pipe, the O'Malleys burned coal and pine. There was nothing. Just a rigid, white silence that muffled sound and choked the light. He reached the porch. The front door, thick wood with a cracked, glazed window, was slightly ajar, maybe 2 inches. Enough for the snow to have piled on the indoor mat in a perfect, geometric wedge. Thorne eased it open with the toe of his boot. The smell that hit him wasn't death, not exactly. It was worse. It was the smell of a hot meal that had gone cold, mixed with old wool, stale coal smoke, and something else, a sharp, high mineral tang, like ozone or fresh-cut iron. Inside, the living room was unnervingly neat. A game of solitaire was laid out on the kitchen table, the cards frozen in a half-dealt pattern. A thermos of coffee sat beside it. A book, a tattered Western paperback, lay face down on the armchair, marking a page. But the fire in the iron stove was out. Not just embers, but a cold, dead ash bed. It looked like it had been out for days, which didn't track. Nobody left a fire die in this cold. Not out here. To let the fire go was to sign your own death warrant. Thorne drew the rifle up, the sound of the bolt clicking home echoing too loud in the small space. Hello. His voice was a flat, unceremonious thing. Sheriff Thorne. Anyone home? Silence. The clock on the mantelpiece, a small wooden thing, had stopped at 3:17. He checked the bedrooms. Bedding thrown back, nothing amiss. In the main bedroom, he found the first clue that felt truly wrong. The bureau drawers were all pulled out, not flung open in a search, but systematically extended, as if they were waiting for someone to pack. On top of the dresser sat a small, empty leather coin pouch, the kind old man O'Malley always kept his silver dollar in. The freezer, in the utility room, was running. Thorne opened the heavy lid. It was fully stocked, frozen steaks, deer sausage, and bags of vegetables, all hard as rocks. The power hadn't failed. The food hadn't been packed or moved. He went back to the kitchen, following the line of the strange, metallic smell. It led to the back door, the one that opened onto the small, covered porch facing the corral. This door was wide open. He stepped out onto the back porch. The wind, still non-existent, made the cold feel even sharper. The backyard was a sheet of unbroken white, save for one distinct, highly unnatural thing. The O'Malleys owned two ATVs, a red one and a blue one. The tracks he had seen on the county road belonged to the blue one, and the vehicle itself was nowhere in sight. But right here, coming away from the porch, were two perfectly clear sets of human footprints. The prints were heel-toe, deep in the snow, like someone was walking normally. Two people. But the tracks didn't go toward the road. They didn't go toward the barn. They went straight out into the dead center of the frozen pasture, toward the low, rounded rise of the foothills. And then, about 50 yards out, they stopped. Not covered by snow. Not turned back. They just ended. Thorne stood on the porch, his breath pluming out in a frantic cloud that obscured his vision for a moment. He lowered the rifle slowly. He took off his glove and rubbed his cheek, feeling the sting of the cold that was now starting to burrow in. He stepped off the porch and began to walk toward the spot. The snow groaned its protest beneath him with every step. When he reached the end of the line of tracks, he saw what he had missed from a distance. The last prints were not normal. They were shallow, like the people were suddenly lighter. And they weren't pointed forward. The very last print of the left foot, and the very last print of the right, were subtly angled inward, towards each other. Like the person had pivoted on the ball of their foot, almost on an invisible dime. As if they had looked up, seen something directly overhead, and been hoisted, gently, straight up into the air. He looked up at the sky. Curdled milk. Nothing but low, gray cloud. Then he looked down again. Right in the middle of where the four final prints met, there was a tiny, melted patch of snow. It was no bigger than a silver dollar, perfectly round, and the dark earth beneath it was slightly damp. And in that damp patch, Thorne could just make out a scattering of tiny, black specks. He knelt down, pushing the rifle into the snow. He scraped up a few specks with his knife blade. They were small, shiny, and curved. Like a crow's broken feather barbs. The metallic smell was strong here. Ozone. Iron. Thorne stood up, the silence of the basin pressing on his eardrums, a ringing, high note of dread. There were no prints leaving this spot. The wind had not picked up the snow, no animal had walked through. The snow surrounding the circle was undisturbed, pristine. The O'Malleys had finished their walk, turned inward, and vanished. They hadn't run, hadn't struggled, hadn't cried out. They had just stopped being there. And the only witnesses were the cold and the empty sky. Thorne looked back at the ranch house, neat, cold, the abandoned game of solitaire waiting. He looked back at his truck, a distant speck of red and rust. He knew what the moral had to be out here: you don't just walk off the land. The land takes you, or you fall down dead on it. You don't just disappear up. He tucked his knife, pushed the specks deep into his pocket, and started walking the perimeter, the long sweep of the frozen plain. He walked toward the gray mountains until the low, bruised light began to fail, knowing he would not find them. When the last of the sun had gone, and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, Thorne turned and started walking back to the truck. He was cold, but not freezing. The fear had turned into a tight, hard ball in his gut, heating his core. He was no longer thinking about the O'Malleys, but about the crows. Why leave? Why leave the food, the warm bodies, the promise of carrion? He reached the truck, started the engine, and turned the heater up to full blast, but the cold stayed with him. It was a cold that didn't come from the air. He looked in his side mirror before driving away. The ranch house was just a black silhouette now, and behind it, the frozen pasture lay under a new, blue-black blanket of night. He saw the tiny spark then, no bigger than a match head. High, high above the O'Malley place, directly over the spot where the tracks had ended. The point of light was moving, too slow to be a plane, too high to be a drone. And it was moving in slow, impossibly wide circles. It was silent. It was waiting. And as Thorn watched, the single, steady spark of light was joined by another, and then another, until there were a dozen, arranged in a quiet, loose formation, like a constellation that had fallen out of alignment. He didn't wait to see if the stars were starting to fall. He slammed the truck into gear, spun out onto the county road, and drove. He drove until he was 30 miles past the county line, past the nearest gas station, past the last of the lonely trails. He pulled over only when he reached the safety of the nearest town streetlights, the synthetic orange glow a comforting, human lie. He sat there for a long time, hands shaking on the wheel, the keys still in the ignition. He looked in the rearview mirror again, expecting to see the lights. They were gone. But in the reflection, sitting quietly on his roof rack, he saw two black shapes, small and still. The crows. They hadn't left the basin. They had just been waiting for the only moving thing to return to life, and now they were riding. Silent, patient, and judging. Thorn put the truck back in drive and kept going, heading east, heading anywhere but back to the empty silence of the snow. He was an hour out of the county, leaving his post, leaving the O'Malleys unsolved, and he knew two things with absolute, bone-deep certainty. He was never going back to Salt Creek. The metallic, high smell of iron and ozone would always be on the wind behind him, and the crows would not stop riding until he reached a place where the air was too hot and loud for them to breathe. The silence of the basin had been a warning, and now it was a pursuit. He drove faster. 7th story. The first unnerving thing about Bitter Creek in deep winter wasn't the cold, though the cold was a blade. It was the silence. Not the soft, muffled quiet of a fresh snowfall, but a hard, brittle vacuum where sound went to die. The wind, which usually roared down from the bighorns like a locomotive, only hissed now, a sound like a frayed rope being pulled slowly across a stone. Jedediah Cross knew the Wyoming high desert. He'd lived on the edge of the Red Desert 27 years, enough to know that when the land held its breath like this, something was listening. He was hauling supplies, feed, stovepipe, and a case of cheap whiskey, to the old O'Malley place, 50 miles off the pavement. The O'Malleys were already gone, their ranch was now a leasehold for a holding company out of Denver, looked after by a caretaker named Elias. A quiet man, Elias, who didn't ask questions and whose paychecks arrived by wire. Jed was 3 days late. The blizzard had pinned him down, and now the sky was that merciless blue-white that promised $40°F by sundown. He topped the rise on the Ridge Road, his beat-up $text, $78 Ford truck chewing through the crusty drift, and saw the O'Malley place. A cluster of cottonwoods, a rusting windmill, and the skeletal outline of the barn and house, huddled against the vast, frozen plain. What hit him wasn't the relief of arrival, but a spike of cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. The dogs were gone. Elias kept 2 big Anatolian shepherds, animals that lived to guard. They were supposed to be the first sign of life, barking their heads off from the pen by the corral. The pen was empty. No footprints in the hard snow leading out, just the clean, unbroken surface right up to the wire. Jed killed the engine. The resulting absolute stillness was physically painful. He grabbed his lever action from the rack, chambered around just in case, and stepped out. The dry snow crunched under his heavy boot, the sound explosively loud. He walked past the empty dog pen and up to the porch. The front door was ajar, not kicked in, but standing open about 4 inches, a careless mistake in a land where a careless mistake meant freezing solid inside your own kitchen. Elias? Jed called, his voice flat. No answer. Only the cold, persistent hiss of the wind around the clapboards. He pushed the door open. The house was cold as an icebox, but it shouldn't have been. Elias was meticulous about feeding the stove. The smell inside wasn't wood smoke, but something faint and mineral, like old pennies. In the kitchen, a pot of coffee was still on the stove's cold burner. A half-eaten bowl of oatmeal sat on the table. Elias had been interrupted. Jed moved through the house. Living room, spare bedroom, storage closet, all empty. He reached the master bedroom. The narrow bed was neatly made. On the bedside table lay a cheap pulp western, spine down, marking a page. He stopped, his attention snagged by the window. Elias, like any ranch hand, taped up the drafts every fall. Every window except this one. This one was wide open, letting in a needle-sharp draft and a fan of snow that had drifted halfway across the floor. But the screen, the wire screen meant to keep the flies out in summer, was tacked back in place, neat and flush with the frame. Jed looked from the open window to the clean-swept drift on the floor, then back to the closed screen. He knelt, checking the sill. No marks. No disturbance. No way a man got out that window, especially not a man the size of Elias. He backed out, feeling the hair on his arms prickle. Uncanny. He went out to the barn. The air inside was dense with the smell of old hay and dried manure. The 2 horses were in their stalls, stamping softly. Elias was the only other soul for 50 miles. He found him in the tack room. Elias wasn't frozen. He wasn't bloody. He was sitting on the low wooden bench where he usually cleaned his gear, his back to Jed. His coat was still buttoned, his hat sat on his head, and his gloves were tucked into his belt. Elias? You gave me a hell of a scare, man. Elias didn't move. Jed took a step closer, his stomach tightening. He reached out and touched Elias's shoulder. The caretaker tumbled over sideways, hitting the dirt floor with a stiff, muffled thud. Jed stood over him, holding his breath, the rifle hanging loose in his hand. Elias's eyes were open, looking up at the rafters, the pale blue of them clouded over. But what made Jed's gorge rise was what was missing. Elias had been emptied out. Not violently. There was no wound. His face was slack, his skin a dead yellow-gray. But his clothes, his thick Carhartts and woolen shirt, draped on him like clothes on a scarecrow. His bones seemed to have collapsed inward. The man's weight, which should have been $text, $190 pounds of hardened muscle and gristle, felt like a bag of dried leaves. Jed didn't panic. Panic was a waste of good air. He backed slowly out of the tack room. He knew what an animal looked like when it was starved. This was different. This was hollowed. As if everything that made Elias a man, his organs, his blood, the marrow in his bones, had been carefully removed and the shell reset. He got out of the barn and leaned against the cold wood, forcing himself to breathe the harsh, dry air. He looked across the silent, snowbound plain. The mountains were a jagged, dark line on the horizon, too far to matter. No road, no tracks, no smoke. Only the vast, listening land. He finally understood the silence. It wasn't that the wind was quiet. It was that the air itself was being drawn out, creating that dead vacuum around the house. He looked back at the house, at the wide-open window with the intact screen. Then, he looked up at the roofline. On the peak of the eaves, where the snow should have been thick, there was a patch of bare, blackened shingle, like a burn. And sitting there, still as carved stone, was a bird. It wasn't a crow. It was too big, and its feathers weren't black, but a pale, dusty gray, almost translucent in the cruel light. It was hunched over, its neck drawn in, looking down at Jed with eyes that seemed too large for its small, sharp head. Its gaze held no predatory malice, only an enormous, crushing need. The air around it shimmered slightly, and Jed heard, not with his ears, but deep in his chest, the sound he'd been dreading since he arrived, a single, faint, high-pitched whistle. A sound like air being sucked through a keyhole at incredible pressure. Jed knew then, with the sudden, fatal clarity of a man who has run out of ground, that the creature had not entered the house through the window. It had simply opened the screen, whistled, and waited. It wasn't a monster that attacked you. It was a vessel that called to you, and when you looked at it, it called the life right out of you, leaving only the clothes and the dry, quiet shell. And the colder it was, the more perfect the vacuum, the clearer the call. He turned and bolted for the ford, throwing the rifle onto the seat. He slammed the door and cranked the ignition. The engine groaned once, twice, then caught, rattling violently. As he threw the stick into reverse, he glanced back at the roof. The gray bird was gone. But on the snow a few yards from the truck, right where the coffee pot on the stove was pointing, lay one of the Anatolian shepherds. It was lying on its side, its fur undisturbed, its large body completely, unnaturally flat, a thick rug of bone and hide. And from the empty socket of its large, still eye, a single, tiny trail of dried white powder, like fine salt, had trickled onto the pristine snow. Jed didn't stop to think about the $500 worth of supplies in the truck bed, or the promise he'd made to the holding company. He drove. He kept the accelerator mashed to the floor, fishtailing wildly through the drifts, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. The O'Malley place grew smaller, becoming just another dark scratch on the endless white canvas. He drove for 3 hours until the sun was dipping low and the shadows were long and blue, promising the killer temperature of true winter night. He finally stopped on the crest of the ridge where he'd first seen the ranch, pulled over by the need to breathe without the ghost of that high, thin whistle in his head. He looked back one last time. The O'Malley ranch was gone, swallowed by the curve of the earth and the encroaching darkness. But in the passenger seat beside him, sitting neatly atop the case of cheap whiskey he was supposed to have delivered, was the pulp western Jed had seen on Elias's bedside table. Spine down, marking the page. Jed didn't remember picking it up. He didn't remember touching the book at all. His fingers were white claws on the steering wheel. He slowly reached out and touched the book. It felt cool, dry, and lighter than it should have been. He didn't open it. He just stared at the page marker. The book had moved him. It had crossed the threshold of the truck without his knowledge. He thought of the dogs, of Elias, of the whistling Stillness, and the terrible, needing eyes of the gray bird. He started the engine again, leaving the book on the seat, a terrible secret writing beside him, and pointed the truck east, toward the lights of the distant highway. It was only when the truck began to warm up that he felt the sudden, alarming lightness in his chest, and noticed the slow, measured hiss of his own breath, which seemed to be pulling thin and dry and cold, not just from the cab's air, but from somewhere much, much deeper inside him. The journey had not ended. It had simply followed him home. He drove on, listening to the thin, whistling sound of the air being drawn from his own lungs, wondering how far he could get before he was just a man-shaped coat and an empty set of wheels. 8th story. Deputy Marshal Alistair, Al, Kalin had been counting the number of days since the snow started. Not since it fell, but since it stopped. It was day 7 since the sky had sealed shut, since the last wisp of engine exhaust had frozen solid and dusted the town square like powdered sugar. 7 days of silence so deep it felt less like an absence of sound and more like a heavy, cold presence leaning against the eardrums. The silence was the first thing that got you out here. Not the cold, not the isolation. The silence. You hear that? Al asked, not looking at the woman beside him. He kept his eyes on the white nothing ahead. Hear what, Al? The blood freezing in my veins. The woman, Ruth Vance, a former ranch hand turned itinerant truck driver, squinted past the windshield. She hadn't smiled once in 3 days. Her voice was already starting to crack like dry leather. That, Al insisted, pointing a gloved finger at the flat, wind-scoured stretch of what used to be Highway 16. The truck. Our truck. She's quiet. Their old '78 Ford F-350, nicknamed the Mule, was their only lifeline. It sat nose-deep in a drift 5 miles outside of Black Creek, Wyoming, a dying coal town that had already been dying when the winter killed it for good. The engine had seized up 3 nights ago. They'd been holed up in the cab, rationing beef jerky and stale coffee. But the engine block, even when cold, had a sound. A tiny, ticking protest as the metal contracted. A faint, low hum from the frozen oil. An audible weight of steel and wire waiting for life. Now, there was nothing. The mule had stopped breathing. "It's 30 below zero, Marshal," Ruth said, her breath fogging the small patch she'd cleared on the window. "The metal shrinks up. It's quiet because it's dead." "No," Al murmured, pulling his weathered sheepskin coat tighter. He looked around. They were on the plains, but the plains weren't flat here. They were long, rolling white dunes, carved by a perpetual, dry wind coming down from the Rockies, the wind that had stopped 7 days ago. To the east, the mountains were a jagged line of obsidian and slate, dusted in white, looking too close, too high, and utterly indifferent. The air wasn't moving. The snow wasn't falling. Nothing was. "Listen, Ruth," Al whispered. "There's no wind. The only thing holding the snow off that highway is a 30-mile-an-hour gale. You been out here long as me. You ever seen a winter day without wind in the Backbone Range?" Ruth's eyes narrowed, the sun wrinkles around them hardening. She was a woman who'd seen enough death on the road to know that sometimes, the quiet was the danger. "It ain't natural," she agreed, and that was the moment the dread fully settled, not on Al, but between them, like a third passenger in the cab. Al had tracked the man for 4 weeks. Silas Thorne. Accused of robbing the First National Bank in Salt Lake City, then shooting a deputy who tried to stop him. A clean, clinical criminal who wore a bespoke suit and left no witnesses. Al had chased him north, into the dead end of winter. The trail had led to Black Creek. When Al rode in, the town was already half vacated. The remaining 23 souls, mostly old miners and the mayor, were huddled in the mercantile, waiting for the plows that would never arrive. Mule, and planned to wait out the storm. Now, Silas was still back there, separated from them by a cage of cold steel wire. Al turned and looked at the prisoner. Silas Thorne wasn't looking out. He was looking at the roof of the cab. He was wearing the same dark, perfect suit, even though the temperature in the back must have been unbearable. "You know what the silence means, don't you, Thorne?" Al asked him. Silas didn't move. He hadn't asked for food, water, or heat since the engine died. He looked like an exhibit carved from pale wax. "The cold is waiting for us, Marshal," Silas finally said, his voice a dry, reedy sound, devoid of fear. "It's just resting its weight." Ruth shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Something else is resting its weight," Al countered, getting out of the cab. He walked to the back of the truck. The hinges were frozen solid. He smashed the thin layer of ice with his shoulder, wrenched the door open, and looked down at the snow. The mule had been sitting here for 3 days. The snow around the tires should have been undisturbed, an unbroken mantle of white save for the drifts the wind had piled up. But it wasn't. About 5 feet out from the truck, running parallel to the highway, were marks. They weren't footprints. They were too long, too shallow, and too perfectly spaced. They looked like a pair of long poles being dragged through the powder, separated by the width of a man's shoulders. Like the tracks of a person walking on extremely long, narrow stilts, but the impression was barely deeper than a shadow. They started up the road, came even with the truck, and then vanished as if the walker had simply lifted them up and flown away. Al felt the cold move from the air and into his chest. This was high country, where the wind scoured the earth. Anything that touched the ground here left a clear impression. He stood there, staring at the unsettling symmetry of the marks. "What is it, Al?" Ruth's voice was sharp with alarm. "Something walked by," he said, not taking his eyes off the snow. "In the dead of night. Past 30 below. And I didn't hear a thing." He looked back in the cab. Silas Thorne was watching him, a neutral, unsettling half-smile on his face. "That's the frontier justice I told you about, Marshal," Silas said. "The kind that doesn't leave a print that makes sense." Al slammed the door shut and went back to the front. He pulled his rifle from the rack. "We walk," he declared. "We're closer to an abandoned ranch at the mouth of Red Rock Canyon than we are to Black Creek. It's 8 miles. We make it by sundown." They walked single file, Al, rifle ready, Ruth, her face a mask of determination, and Silas Thorne, cuffed, walking between them. Al had tied a short length of rope between his own belt and Silas's cuffs, a tether to justice. They walked for 2 hours. The snow was deceptively deep off the plowed road, forcing them onto the white, packed asphalt, which was now less a road and more a slightly raised, frozen ribbon in the vastness. The only sound was the crunch of their own boots. The silence was heavier now, thicker, like they were walking at the bottom of a frozen sea. Then, Ruth stopped dead. She held up a hand. "Hold on," she whispered. Al stopped, his heart hammering in the silence. He strained his ears. He heard the crunch of Silas's boots behind him. And the distant, soft thump of his own blood. "It's not here," Ruth said. "I can't feel it." "Feel what?" "The cold. The right cold. It's freezing, Al, but it's an empty cold, like a vault that's been opened. It's supposed to be biting, a live thing, clawing at your skin. This is a dead cold. Like the ground itself is sucking the heat out of the air." As if on cue, a sudden chill hit them. A sharp, localized wave that made the hairs on Al's arms stand up, despite the thick coat. It didn't come from the mountains or the ground. It came from ahead. "Keep walking," Al ordered, gripping the rifle tighter. After a few more minutes, Al saw the ranch. The Red Rock Cattle Company sign was a skeletal shadow on a rusted pole. The main ranch house was a small, 2-story stone structure, hunkered against the canyon wall like a tired beast. The back wall of the house abutted the sheer red rock face, the only protection from the wind that wasn't there. As they approached, Al noticed something deeply wrong with the house. The roof was covered in a heavy, pristine blanket of snow, the chimney unsmoked for years. But the windows. Every single window, front and back, ground floor and second story, was shattered. Not broken out, but shattered inward, like a series of small, internal explosions. Shards of ice-covered glass lay on the porch, untouched by wind, glittering in the low winter sun. "Ranch was abandoned 5 years ago," Ruth muttered. "Vandals? No one drives 8 miles into this to break a window," Al replied, pushing open the heavy, creaking wooden front door. The interior was colder than the outside air. A wave of the dead cold washed over them. Dust motes hung absolutely still in the beam of light slicing through the broken windows. The air itself smelled of deep, undisturbed frost, dust, and something else, a clean, coppery smell. They moved quickly through the ground floor, checking the rooms. Everything was preserved in a layer of dust and ice crystals. Kitchen, parlor, dining room. Nothing disturbed except for the glass. They reached the back room, the ranch office. Al shined his flashlight into the gloom. The desk was centered under a large, empty hole in the ceiling where a light fixture had once hung. On the desk, arranged like a still life, were dozens of small objects, coins, marbles, pieces of ceramic from a broken plate, a few spent brass cartridges. And they were all frozen solid. Not just covered in frost, but encased in a perfectly clear, 6-sided column of ice. Al reached out a trembling hand and touched the desk. The wood was so cold it felt wet. Then, Silas Thorne let out a low, almost satisfied sigh. "They were waiting here, Marshal," the prisoner said, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of something that sounded like wonder. "They just waited for the air to be still enough." Al turned to look at him, but Silas was looking up at the ceiling. Following his gaze, Al lifted his flashlight. The beam found the ceiling directly above the desk. There was a faint, shimmering, barely visible layer of ice on the wood. And pressed into that ice, running from the center of the room to the walls, were the same strange marks they'd seen outside. Long, shallow impressions, separated by a man's shoulders. The tracks were on the ceiling. "Get out, Ruth," Al hissed, pushing her toward the door. "Wait," she said, her voice shaking. She pointed a gloved finger at the center of the room, right over the desk. Hanging from the ceiling, caught in a sliver of fractured ice, was a single, long strand of dark, fine hair. It was too long for any creature, too fine for any animal. It was then that they heard the sound. It came from the main hallway. It was the faintest sound imaginable, a dry, gentle scrape against the wooden floor, followed by another, and another. Scrape. 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 The sound of something very light, moving very slowly, dragging its weight across the floor. Al aimed the rifle at the doorway, his finger on the trigger. He could feel the tether to Silas Thorne tightening around his belt. The scraping stopped directly at the threshold. The silence that followed was absolute. "They don't like the wind, Marshal," Silas whispered, his voice dangerously close to Al's ear. "They can only hold their shape when the air is still. That's why we were so quiet, isn't it? The wind stopped for them." Al saw the shadow first. A long, impossibly attenuated darkness that stretched across the floor from the doorway, bending impossibly as it climbed the wall. He fired the rifle. The explosion was deafening, the sound of civilization tearing the silence apart. The bullet tore through the air where the shadow was, blowing a hole in the plaster. The scraping sound didn't return. The shadow remained. "It doesn't bleed, Al," Ruth said, clutching the doorframe, her eyes wide with a primal terror. Then, from the darkness of the hallway, a dry, faint clicking sound began. Not like bone. Like ice. Ice on ice. Al turned to run, yanking the rope tied to Silas. But Silas Thorne didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, a look of profound, cold understanding on his face. "Don't you see, Marshal?" Silas said, his voice finally losing its calm, but replacing it not with fear, but with an icy exultation. "We're the only warm things left. And the justice they bring, it's clean. Geometric. The ultimate cold. Al. Come on." Ruth screamed from the hall. Al tore at the rope connecting him to the cuffs, ripping his glove. He looked at Silas, who was now smiling a full, wide, terrifying smile. Then, the clicking sped up, moving closer, and Silas Thorne's face went slack. Not with fear, but with a sudden, complete emptiness. He took a staggering step forward, and as he moved, a perfectly formed, hexagonal column of clear ice began to spread from his chest, blooming over his dark suit, encasing his torso with impossible speed. Al Kalin threw himself toward the doorway. Al and Ruth ran out onto the plains. They didn't run toward the mountains, which felt like a place of burial. They ran onto the flat, open highway, toward the faint, barely visible smudge of the sun dipping behind the mountains. They ran until the icy air burned their lungs and the blood pounded in their heads, drowning out the silence. Al looked back once. The Red Rock Ranch house stood in the vast white landscape. The open doorway was a black square in the rock face. And then he saw it. Moving out of the doorway, onto the white plain, was a figure. Tall, immensely thin, moving with a series of slow, dragging movements. It was barely visible, a shimmering distortion in the air, but the setting sun caught the light just right. It was black against the white snow, impossibly slender, looking like a man made of shadow, but moving with the strange, measured gait of the tracks they'd seen. It was coming after them. Al kept running, pulling Ruth along. They ran until the sun was gone, until the temperature dropped into the depths of lethal cold, and they collapsed behind a low, wind-scoured ridge. Al put his arm around Ruth, trying to share a single, meager sliver of warmth. "What was it?" she whispered, tears freezing instantly on her cheeks. "Justice," Al whispered back, remembering Silas's final, empty smile. "The kind that comes when the world is still." He looked down at his right hand, the one that had ripped his glove trying to get away. It was a bad tear, and his fingers were turning white. As he watched, he saw a faint, crystalline shimmer near his fingernail. A tiny, perfect hexagon of ice, forming not on the surface of his skin, but underneath it, in the deep wound where his blood was trying to clot. Al-Khalan closed his eyes and listened to the silence. It was heavier than ever. And then, he heard the faint, dry scrape begin again, kilometers away, moving slowly, relentlessly, across the utterly still, frozen plain. The cold was catching up. The cold that wasn't cold, but a kind of waiting. And it always got its man.